My name is Denise Carter. I'm 35 years old. And this is the story of how I signed a loan to help my sister have her dream wedding, and ended up watching her vanish overseas with my name on $55,000 of debt, until I turned the tables in a way no one saw coming. The night of Madison's wedding was straight out of a lifestyle magazine. The Boston Riverfront Hotel ballroom shimmered with a glow that felt fake in all the worst ways. Crystal chandeliers glistened overhead, bouncing light off champagne glasses held by guests in $1,000 suits. Madison floated across the floor in a $12,000 designer gown like she was royalty, spinning in slow motion while everyone smiled as if they weren't just guests, they were witnesses to a perfect fairy tale. But in the corner of that perfect ballroom, I stood stiff, a glass of champagne untouched in my hand, my mind drowning not in the music, but in the rising anxiety of numbers. 50,000. That loan. That signature. My name. Only mine. Because the truth was, no one else in the family had good enough credit. Not even Madison's husband Brad, whose tech startup hadn't even filed for an EIN yet. But that didn't stop them from pushing for a wedding that looked like something out of Versailles. Imported orchids. A-list band. A 10-tier cake that probably cost more than my used sedan. Denise, you're always the logical one, Madison had sobbed weeks earlier, mascara streaked down her cheeks as she dropped to her knees outside my office in downtown New Haven. Please. I can't do this without you. I should have walked away. I should have told her to marry at City Hall like any other broke couple. But I didn't. Because right behind her, arms folded, stood my mother with a look that had haunted me since I was a kid. Don't ruin this for your sister, she said, laying a warm apple pie on my kitchen counter like guilt could be sugared into sweetness. She's always dreamed of this day. You have your job. Your apartment. Your life is already stable. Can't you just help? And there it was. The script I'd heard 1,000 times before. I was the stable one. The logical one. The one who always could, so I always should. My father barely looked up from the sports section. It's just a signature, Denise. You're making this harder than it needs to be. They made it sound so simple. Like co-signing $55,000 for a wedding was as casual as splitting a dinner bill. I looked at Madison's puffy eyes, the trembling lip, the practiced performance that somehow never got rusty. And I said yes. But not before calling my best friend Genesis, who also happened to be a corporate attorney. She sat across from me at my kitchen table 3 nights later, a glass of red wine in one hand and a legal pad in the other. You're seriously going to do this? She asked, brow raised. Only if I control the contract, I said. That night, we wrote the kind of agreement that no one in my family had ever expected me to be capable of. Airtight clauses. Legally sound provisions. But the most important one was buried discreetly under a section labeled Extended Guarantor Liability. If Madison or Brad left the country without repaying the loan in full, the responsibility would legally and automatically transfer to our parents, Albert and Vivian Carter. Their signatures would mean everything. Genesis tapped her finger on the clause. You sure they won't read this? I let out a bitter laugh. They've never read anything I've handed them. Not when it's wrapped in trust. We printed it all on official letterhead. Invited a bank representative to the house for authenticity. And on a breezy spring morning, I watched Madison, Brad, and both my parents sign without reading past the first page. Gosh, Denise, you make everything so complicated, my mother had muttered, signing with a careless swoop. I smiled politely. Just in case, Mom. They all laughed. Toasted with cheap mimosas in the backyard. And within a week, Madison's fantasy wedding was underway, paid in full, on a promise she swore to keep. But the first payment deadline came and went with nothing. I checked the joint account. Nothing. Called Madison's number. Disconnected. Texted Brad. No reply. Then I saw it. An Instagram post from Madison. Her and Brad clinking glasses at a luxury villa in Bali. Behind them, crystal blue waves and a caption that felt like a punch to the gut. To the dreamers who dare to live debt-free, cheers to a new life. I sat there for a full minute in silence, heart thudding in my ears. The comments rolled in deep power couple. Goals. Love like this is rare. I felt nauseated. No one knew they'd walked out on a $55,000 loan. No one knew I was the one left behind to clean up the mess. Again. It would have broken me, once. But not this time. Because they had all signed the contract. Every single one of them. And this time, I wasn't just the co-signer. I was the architect of the fallout. The next day, Genesis walked into my office holding 2 lattes and one look of warning. Tell me you didn't see their new TikTok? I didn't even answer. I just turned my monitor so she could see it. There they were, Madison and Brad, signing the lease for a beachfront property in Dubai, grinning like lottery winners. The caption, finally free. Genesis whistled. They think you're going to bail them out, don't they? They always have. She leaned forward. So what now? I opened the folder on my desk, copies of contracts, screen captures, exit stamps, even hotel check-ins. Now, I said, we let the clause do its job. 10 days passed. Then the phone rang. Not Madison. Not Brad. It was the bank. Miss Denise Carter? As co-signer on loan ID 0422, and based on recent proof of Madison Carter and Bradley Evans' international departure without repayment structure, we are activating Clause 14.2. The repayment responsibility now falls to Albert and Vivian Carter. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just stepped onto my balcony, wrapped myself in a sweater, and watched the sun set over the New Haven skyline. For once, I wasn't carrying anyone else's weight. But the storm was coming. And this time, I wasn't the one about to drown. The call came just before dinner. I was sautéing garlic in olive oil, the scent just starting to fill my apartment when my phone rang with a name I hadn't seen in weeks, Mom. I let it ring until the voicemail picked up. Not because I didn't want to answer, but because I wanted her to feel what silence tasted like. She called again. And again. By the third call, I wiped my hands and picked up. Denise, she breathed, like someone who'd just been told the sky was falling. What the hell is going on? The bank said we owe them $55,000. Is this some kind of joke? I didn't flinch. I stirred the garlic calmly and said, it's not a joke, Mom. It's in the contract. Clause 14.2. She didn't speak. For a moment, I thought the line had dropped. You tricked us. Her voice came back cold. You trapped your own family. No, I replied, plating my pasta. I protected myself. You all signed that document without reading a word. Because you said? I said nothing. I cut her off. You assumed. You always assume I'll clean up your messes. This time, I didn't. The next voice I heard wasn't hers. My father had taken the phone. You think this is funny, Denise? You think watching your parents suffer is some kind of payback? I sat at my table, alone, sipping water. You mortgaged our house, twice, for Madison. You covered her bakery, her yoga retreat, her fashion internship in Paris, but not once did you offer me so much as a thank you when I helped. Not when I paid off your medical bills. Not when I covered Madison's rent for 3 months without even a text back. You're tearing the family apart, he said, voice low and shaking with suppressed rage. No, I said again. I'm just refusing to hold it together anymore. Click. The line went dead. That night, I slept better than I had in months. 10 days later, the foreclosure notice was served. I wasn't supposed to know, but Genesis sent me a photo of the paperwork spread across their dining table. Bright red letters stamped across the top, final notice. The same living room where my mother had once told me, Madison needs space to be creative, so just be quiet while she's here. The house was no longer a home. It was a time bomb. And they knew who lit the fuse. They tried everything after that. Emails, voicemails, Facebook messages filled with guilt, rage, and every manipulation tactic they'd ever used before. My mom left a voicemail crying about how she'd lost her sense of taste from stress. My dad emailed a long-winded apology, which ended with, "But family shouldn't punish each other like this." Genesis said it best over lunch, "They don't miss you. They miss the version of you they could exploit." I nodded, stirring my tea. They don't miss me at all. They miss my credit score. 3 weeks after the foreclosure notice, Madison's Instagram reactivated. She was back online like nothing had happened, except this time, instead of Bali, she was in Dubai. Spa selfies. Brunch with influencers. Captioned, "When you stop worrying and start living." I stared at the screen, stomach still. Then I opened the Dropbox folder I'd been slowly filling for 6 months. Screenshots. Emails. Messages between Madison and Brad. Voice memos from parties, bragging about how they scammed the bank, how they planned to move money under different names, how Denise would panic and clean up the mess anyway. Genesis listened with her jaw tight. "This is more than avoidance," she said. "This is fraud." I nodded. "And I have everything." So we compiled it. Cleaned it. Cross-checked dates, accounts, social media tags. It wasn't just a case of fleeing debt anymore. It was premeditated. Coordinated. Exploited across state lines and international borders. One final touch, the contract. The one I had made them sign, scanned with timestamps, with copies filed at the bank, and a digital backup in my cloud. Genesis added it to the final document. "This," she said, sliding the folder across the table, "is going to land them in federal court." I didn't feel joy. Not yet. I only felt ready. 3 days later, the Department of Justice acknowledged receipt of the evidence package. 1 week after that, Madison's world began to crumble. I was sipping coffee on my balcony when the first headline dropped. American entrepreneur arrested in Dubai for fraud investigation tied to U.S. debt scheme. Below the headline was a picture of Brad, red-faced and handcuffed, being escorted out of a tech summit by police. Behind him, cameras flashed, and attendees whispered. Genesis called 5 minutes later, voice giddy. "We did it. Lily, they're prosecuting. Madison's next." I didn't smile. I just replied, "Good." That same night, Madison tried to call. Blocked. She messaged me on WhatsApp. "You won, okay? I get it. Can we talk?" I ignored it. She messaged again. "They froze everything. We're stuck in the airport. I'm scared, Denise. I'm your sister." That word again. Sister. A word she remembered only when her credit card was declined or her name showed up on a court summons. I replied with a single line. "Actions have consequences." And then I blocked her too. By the time the Vermont vacation home was listed for sale, the news had gone viral. A viral Twitter thread laid out the entire saga, Madison's curated dream life, the luxury photos, the private jet captions, all built on a house of lies and a sister she thought she could leave holding the bag. But I didn't hold the bag. I rewrote the rules. And now the house, the same house my mother promised would one day be mine, but not now, was on public auction for pennies on the dollar. I bought it in cash. No bidding war. No press. Just a single bidder, under my LLC's name, at a small courthouse auction on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The clerk handed me the deed. It was done. I owned it. Not because I wanted it, but because I could. I drove up to Vermont the following weekend. It was early fall, the trees beginning to burn in orange and crimson, the kind of picturesque postcard scene my mother used to romanticize. "We'll retire here someday," she'd often say. "This will always be the Carter family haven." Except the Carters had burned it to the ground long before I ever signed that loan. I parked in the gravel driveway, stepped out, and just stood there for a moment. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. The shadows that once felt massive now felt pathetic. I unlocked the front door with the new key the county clerk had given me and stepped into stale air and echoes. The place had already been stripped of valuables. No more antique clocks. No more leather-bound books I was never allowed to touch. No Madison and Brad wedding photo hanging over the fireplace like they were the royal couple of our bloodline. They hadn't even cleaned up. Boxes were left scattered. Food containers in the kitchen. An envelope on the table addressed to my mother, opened and creased at the edges. I glanced inside. It was the final foreclosure confirmation. The words, "property transferred," stamped in bold. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just walked the halls slowly, one last time, letting each room show me its true face. This wasn't a home. It had never been one for me. It was a monument to favoritism. A canvas where my parents painted a world where I was always second best, dependable Denise, the fallback option. The calculator. The human insurance policy. That night, I stayed in one of the guest rooms. I didn't unpack. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how different life could have been if they'd loved me the way they loved Madison. If they had seen me as more than a financial safety net. The next morning, my phone buzzed. A text from Genesis. Madison's lawyer reached out. She's officially being charged. Wire fraud, conspiracy, misrepresentation of assets. Attached was a link to the court notice. I opened it. There it was, the United States versus Madison Carter and Bradley Evans. No more Instagram filters. No more curated illusions. They were defendants now. The comments online had turned savage. People tore Madison apart, exposing old tweets where she mocked 9-to-5 drones, calling herself a visionary escaping the hamster wheel. Influencers who once collaborated with her quietly deleted their posts. Even Brad's startup website had been taken down, replaced with a government seizure banner. But the most telling detail was the voicemail I got that evening. It came from my mother. "Denise, your father, he lost his job," she said through a broken voice. "We have nowhere to go. The apartment we're staying in, the lease is up next month. Can we talk?" She said talk like it wasn't already 20 years too late. I didn't answer. But I knew they wouldn't stop. And I was right. 3 days later, I came home to find both of them waiting outside my condo building. My mother wore an old coat she used to consider beneath her. My father looked like he hadn't shaved in days. "Denise, please," she said, stepping toward me. "We just want to talk. Just, let us explain." "Explain?" I tilted my head. "Explain why you signed a contract you never read. Or why you spent 35 years only defending Madison while I kept your lights on?" "Denise." "No," I snapped. "You only come to me when you need something. When you want money. A place to sleep. An emergency solved." My father finally spoke. "We're still your parents." I laughed, quietly, bitterly. "No. You're just two people I share DNA with. Parents protect their children. You sold me off emotionally the minute you decided Madison's fantasy was more important than my sanity. They didn't deny it. They didn't even have the strength to argue anymore." "Let us stay in the Vermont house," my mother whispered. "Just until we get back on our feet." I stared at her for a long time. Then I reached into my purse, pulled out the house key, and tossed it onto the pavement between us. "Go ahead," I said. "But you're going to find out the hard way." They blinked at me, confused. I got in my car, drove away, and waited. Sure enough, 5 hours later, I got the call. "Denise," my mother sobbed. "The locks don't work. You changed them." I sipped my tea. "No, Mom. I work. And I changed the locks because I work. Because I paid for it. Because it's mine." "You're cruel." I hung up. Later that night, I stood on my Vermont porch again, alone. I looked out at the moonlit hills, the wind brushing against my skin. No drama. No yelling. No demands. Just silence. And for the first time in my adult life, I realized that silence wasn't empty. It was peace. The Vermont house had always been a symbol. To my parents, it was the status badge they flashed at Christmas parties and neighborhood barbecues. The Carters? Oh yes, they have that gorgeous place near Stowe. To Madison, it was her playground, weekend getaways with Brad, endless Instagram photos on the wraparound porch, pretending it was her reward for working hard. But to me? It was a lie. A promise dangled in front of me my entire life. "One day, Denise, this house will be yours. But not now. Your sister's still finding herself." As if I were already found. As if being responsible meant I didn't need anything. So I didn't feel guilty changing the locks. I didn't feel guilty when I tore down the old family portraits from the staircase wall. The ones where Madison stood front and center, glowing in every shot, and I was always on the edge, half smiling, half forgotten. I didn't even feel guilty when I walked through Madison's old bedroom, now empty and cold, and dropped every single piece of her leftover junk into black trash bags without a second glance. Because guilt was a language they taught me. A control mechanism dressed up in phrases like "you're being too harsh" and "she's your sister." But that language no longer worked on me. Not after what they did. That same week, I received a formal invitation to appear as a witness in the U.S. v. Carter Evans fraud case. Genesis went over the file with me for the 10th time, making sure every receipt, every message, every shred of evidence was clear. "You don't have to be nervous," she said, closing the folder. "You have the truth on your side." I smiled weakly. That never seemed to matter in my family. She looked me in the eye. "It does now." The courtroom wasn't what I expected. It wasn't dramatic. There were no gasps or shouting matches. Just quiet tension and the sound of flipping paper. When I took the stand, I told them everything. I explained how Madison came to me, begging. How my parents cornered me emotionally. How I warned them she was already drowning in debt, but they called me cold. I recited the day they signed the loan documents without reading them. I showed the court the clause. The email Madison sent Brad, bragging about duping Denise again. And then, the recording. Brad, laughing at a party, saying, "She'll pay it. She always does. It's her whole personality." I watched the jury's faces change. That was the moment. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about how disposable they believed I was. When I stepped down, Genesis squeezed my hand. "You just told your story to the one place they can't gaslight you anymore." A few days later, the official charges were handed down. 3 counts of wire fraud. 2 counts of conspiracy to defraud a financial institution. 1 count of international financial misrepresentation. Madison and Brad would be extradited from Dubai. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their travel privileges revoked. Madison posted one last story before her account disappeared. A blurry photo of her in a hotel room, mascara smeared, captioned, "People always turn on you when you're down. Loyalty doesn't exist anymore." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My silence said everything. That weekend, my parents tried once more. This time, they didn't knock. They emailed. Subject, please read. Denise. We know we've made mistakes. But we're still your parents. We're old. We have nothing left. You have the house. The savings. The freedom. Please, don't shut the door forever. Let us come home. Mom and Dad. I stared at the screen for a long time. And then I replied. You already came home. You found the locks changed. That was your answer. Denise. I deleted the thread. No more arguments. No more explanations. I was done performing daughterhood like it was an unpaid job. And the moment I truly felt that weight lift? It was the first snowfall of winter. I woke up in the Vermont house, stepped onto the front porch, and watched soft white flakes drift onto the evergreens. Everything was quiet. Clean. Fresh. I had coffee in one hand and the deed to the house in the other. Fully paid. Fully mine. For once, no part of my life belonged to someone else's mess. I wasn't the forgotten sister. I wasn't the fallback daughter. I was Denise Carter, homeowner, whistleblower, and survivor. And I still had more to reclaim. Because there was one more thing they never expected. I wasn't done yet. The Vermont house became a fortress, not just of brick and wood but of clarity. Every room I repainted was a room reclaimed. Every piece of furniture I replaced was one less reminder of how long I'd lived inside someone else's version of my life. There were no more photo albums on the coffee table, no decorative pillows with my mother's embroidered phrases, no live, laugh, love signs hung ironically in Madison's handwriting. Instead, there was peace. And purpose. But part of that purpose still needed to be fulfilled. Because Madison and Brad didn't just run away from debt, they weaponized it. They flaunted their fraud like it was ambition. And while I was no longer carrying their weight, I couldn't let them slip away quietly through some negotiated plea deal with a slap on the wrist. They weren't just selfish. They were dangerous. Genesis knew it too. One evening, over a bottle of wine, she looked at me across the fireplace and said, "You know the DOJ is still processing the restitution phase. There's a chance, if you file properly, you could recover everything. Not just from them, but your parents, too." I shook my head slowly. "I've already taken the house. Isn't that enough?" She tilted her head. "That house wasn't a gift. It was a wound you wrapped in dignity. This is about the truth, Denise. If you want them to really feel it, you don't stop halfway." She was right. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. So I filed. With Genesis' help, I submitted a formal restitution petition to the federal court, detailing not just the $55,000 loan, but the years of unpaid bailouts, quiet cover-ups, and financial abandonment that stretched all the way back to college, when I dropped out of an internship because Dad needed surgery and Mom couldn't take the stress. I itemized everything. I had receipts. And when I submitted it, I attached a single-page note. This is not vengeance. This is the cost of always being the one who was expected to survive. 2 weeks later, I received a confirmation from the Department of Justice. My restitution filing had been accepted. A separate civil action would be initiated after the criminal trial. The court wouldn't just hear how I'd been used. They would see it. In numbers. In dates. In undeniable facts. The following day, I received another message, this time, from someone unexpected. It was Madison. Through a third-party email service. The subject line, "Please read before you erase me forever." I stared at it for hours before opening it. Denise. I know you probably hate me. I deserve it. I've been awful. But I wasn't trying to destroy you. I felt like I couldn't live the life you had. I didn't want the office job, the quiet nights, the lonely Christmases. I wanted more. I wanted it now. Brad made it all seem easy. And when you co-signed, it felt like a pass. I didn't think you'd fight back. I didn't think you even could. But you did. And now everything's gone. I lost my passport. I'm under surveillance. Brad might go to jail. I might too. And you bought the house back. You won. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm sorry. If there's any chance, please talk to me before the trial. Madison. No apology. Not really. No mention of the Instagram captions. The mocking texts. The deliberate silence after the wedding. Just fear. Fear of what she'd lost now that I was no longer the shield. I didn't reply. I forwarded the email to Genesis instead, who filed it as supplementary evidence of willful neglect and absence of remorse. Let the courts read it. Let them see that even now, Madison couldn't grasp what she'd done. That weekend, I hosted Genesis and a few close friends at the Vermont house. We lit the fireplace, poured mulled wine, and laughed for the first time in what felt like years. You've got good light in here now, one of them said, sipping from a crystal glass. Feels like a home. I looked around at the soft glow of the room. The quiet hum of music. The comfort of people who didn't want anything from me but my presence. It finally is, I said. But even then, I knew something was still unfinished. A story isn't complete until the world knows the truth. So I wrote it. An op-ed for a financial magazine, anonymous at first. Titled, The Cost of Being the Responsible Daughter. It detailed the reality millions of women face when they're guilted into sacrificing their stability for the sake of family fantasy. It went viral. Within days, I received hundreds of messages. From nurses who paid their siblings' tuition. From older sisters forced to clean up mess after mess while parents looked away. From quiet professionals like me, who knew exactly what it meant to be praised for being strong until they said no, and then they were called selfish. I hadn't just told my story. I'd told theirs. And in doing so, I realized. Maybe silence had been my weapon. But my voice? That was the real power. The trial date came like winter, slow at first, then sudden, cold, and impossible to ignore. By the time Madison and Brad were extradited, their world had collapsed like a house of cards. The story had spread beyond finance blogs. It hit national news, socialite sister scams family to fund lavish wedding, caught in Dubai fraud ring. The headlines didn't care for subtlety. Neither did the internet. A meme of Madison crying in court went viral. Someone captioned it, "She wanted a fairy tale ending, turns out she was the villain." I didn't laugh. I didn't feel anything. I was too busy preparing for my testimony. Genesis and I walked into the courthouse on a gray Monday morning, flanked by 2 federal agents and the weight of 10 years of emotional warfare dressed in business casual. Brad barely looked at me. His face was pale, drawn. The cocky smirk he once wore like a suit was gone. Madison, she looked at me. Eyes red. Skin blotchy. A version of her I hadn't seen since we were kids and she'd been caught sneaking out of the house wearing my clothes. She mouthed one word, "Please." I turned away. I took the stand. And I told the truth. The courtroom listened as I read from my records, showed the signed contracts, replayed the audio files. The judge's brow creased at every new revelation, Madison's bragging, Brad's plans to launder money through offshore accounts, their deliberate use of my credit, my kindness, my silence. They weren't just reckless. They were calculated. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. Because by then, I knew exactly who I was. I was no longer Denise, the safety net. I was Denise, the reckoning. When I stepped down, Madison cried. Real tears this time. Not the crocodile kind from wedding dress stores or Instagram levs. She reached out for me as she passed by the bench, escorted in handcuffs. "Denise, please." "I'm sorry." I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. The sound of her sobbing echoed down the corridor as they led her out. 3 days later, the verdict came in. Guilty on all counts. Brad was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison with full restitution. Madison, due to cooperation, a reduced role, and her attorney's last-minute plea, got 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and a court-ordered payment schedule to repay every dollar she owed. The Carter name was now a matter of public record, in bankruptcy filings, criminal dockets, and ethics violation databases. My parents were still in denial. I know because they sent me a final letter. It was handwritten. "Denise, you've destroyed this family. Whatever Madison did, it could have been handled privately. But you made it public. You humiliated us. You let your sister go to jail. You let us lose our home. We don't know who you are anymore. Mom and Dad." I stared at the page. Then I wrote my reply on the back. "I finally know who I am. That's the difference. Denise." I mailed it back. That night, Genesis came over with a bottle of champagne. "To closure," she said, raising her glass. "To peace," I replied. But the real moment of closure came a week later, when I returned to my office in New Haven and found an envelope on my desk. Inside was a single check. $57,000, issued by the court in accordance with my restitution filing. Below it was a typed note. "Ms. Denise Carter. This payment represents full reimbursement for the wedding loan, including accrued interest and damages. You have been formally cleared of all guarantor liability. Thank you for your cooperation in holding the guilty accountable." I held the check in my hands like a trophy. But it wasn't the money. It was the recognition. The validation. The quiet justice that I'd always been denied. I deposited the check, walked out of the bank, and treated myself to a real dinner. No takeout. No discount wine. I booked a reservation at the best restaurant in the city. Alone. Because solitude, when chosen, is not loneliness. It's liberation. Across the table, the waiter smiled and said, "Celebrating something?" I nodded. "Yeah. Myself." And as I sipped from a glass of red that cost more than the dress Madison wore to court, I thought. This is what freedom tastes like. They say the final stage of grief is acceptance. But no one ever tells you what the final stage of betrayal feels like. For me, it wasn't rage. It wasn't even vindication. It was peace. Real, undisturbed, unapologetic peace. A month after the trial ended, I took a week off and stayed in the Vermont house alone. No emails. No court notices. No drama. Just firewood, snow, and the quiet company of my own thoughts. I spent the days renovating little things, changing light fixtures, repainting door frames, sanding the porch rails. It was like I was rebuilding the very bones of the place. Stripping away decades of guilt disguised as tradition. I even cleared out the attic. It was there, tucked behind old boxes labeled Madison, College and Mom's China, that I found an old photo album. One of the few things they hadn't taken. I flipped through it out of curiosity, not nostalgia. There I was. Age 11. In the background of a birthday photo for Madison. Holding the cake, but not in the frame. Another one, high school graduation. Me in my cap and gown, standing next to Madison in designer sunglasses, holding my diploma like it belonged to her. Every photo told the same story. Me, in the background. Her, center stage. I closed the album, carried it downstairs, and tossed it into the fireplace. It burned fast. Madison tried to contact me one last time. Through a message from her court-appointed counselor. She wanted to meet. To talk. To heal. I declined. Not because I was angry. Because I no longer needed anything from her, not an apology, not understanding, not closure. I had given those things to myself. My parents, now living in a one-bedroom rental in rural Connecticut, stopped reaching out. The last I heard, my father was working part-time at a local car dealership, and my mother had taken up sewing classes at the community center. They were rebuilding in their own way, quietly, painfully, without me. I didn't hate them. But I no longer loved the illusion of them. One cold evening, Genesis and I sat on the porch, watching the snow fall around us. She held a mug of cocoa. I held nothing but the stillness. So, she asked, "What now?" I exhaled slowly. "Whatever I want." She smiled. "You ever think about selling the house? Starting fresh somewhere else?" I looked at the place. The porch I rebuilt. The kitchen I redesigned. The silence I fought for. "No," I said. "This house took everything from me once. I'm going to make sure it gives something back." And it did. I started renting out the guest rooms to traveling writers and researchers. People who just needed a break from the noise. People like I used to be, overwhelmed, unnoticed, stretched too thin for too long. I named it the Second Wind House. It became a quiet haven. A sanctuary. And in some poetic twist, my pain turned into a place of healing, not just for me, but for strangers. I never told them the story behind the house. Because it wasn't about that anymore. It was about the woman who lived here now. Me. Denise Carter. Not the cosigner. Not the fixer. Not the fallback. Just me. Months passed. Then one night, as I was closing up the house after the last guests had left for the season, I opened a letter postmarked from a prison facility. It was from Brad. "Denise. I doubt you'll read this, but if you do, I want you to know. I underestimated you. You did what no one ever expected. Not just to me, but to all of them. I don't know if Madison will ever change. I'm not sure I will either. But you. You won. Brad." I folded the letter. I didn't keep it. I burned it too. Because winning wasn't the point. I wasn't chasing victory. I was reclaiming something far more powerful. Agency. And in doing so, I discovered that some stories don't need revenge as their finale. Sometimes, the real revenge is never needing them again. Denise's story reminds us that sometimes, the greatest power lies in not rescuing those who keep setting their own lives on fire. She didn't burn bridges. She simply stopped rebuilding them. If you've ever been the responsible one, the go-to, or the emotional dump truck in your family, remember, setting boundaries isn't cruelty. It's survival. And sometimes, silence is the loudest freedom of all. This is Revenge Echoes, where stories speak louder than revenge. If this story moved you, subscribe for more. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and never forget, justice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it simply walks away.